We've now looked at a number of different phrases, and we've looked at the test of substitution or replacement, where we look to see whether a sequence of words is or is not a constituent by seeing whether we can replace it by a single word or a pro form like a pronoun, or these words like there or here or do so for verb phrases. The other test that we talked about at the beginning is not a replacement test, but what we could call a displacement test. In many languages, you can alter the order of a sentence in order to place a different emphasis on parts of the sentence. You might want to focus a part of the sentence to indicate that it's new or important information, or you might want to indicate that one part of the sentence is something which is already under discussion, or you might want to indicate that some part of the sentence is contrasted to something that's already been mentioned. In all of these cases, the basic meaning of the sentence hasn't changed, but something about what's called its information structure is different. So where the emphasis, where the focus, where the contrast is placed. And the way many languages do this, there are different ways it can be done, but in some languages, this is done by altering the order within the sentence. And crucially for our purposes here, the sequence of words that can be moved around in a sentence to achieve these effects has to be a constituent. So such displacement of sequences of words is again another test for constituency. Now, different languages differ in the kind of displacement that they do in order to achieve emphasis or contrast and so on. So the particular type of movement or displacement will vary from one language to another. Also, there are often additional constraints on what it's possible to displace in this way. So what that means is, if you try to take a sequence of words and move it somewhere else in the sentence, if it fails, that doesn't necessarily tell you that it isn't a constituent, because it will really depend on what other possibilities the language has, or rather what other constraints the language places on such operations. However, if you can move a sequence of words by such a displacement operation, that's very good evidence that it is a constituent. One displacement operation that English uses has been called fronting, or sometimes topicalization. So this is where we take a constituent and displace it to the front or the beginning of the sentence. So this would be, for example, a case like, I've read many novels, but this book I've never read. So the normal order would be, I've never read this book, but in order to contrast it with something that's already been said, I move it to the beginning of the sentence. So that operation is what's called topicalization, or more neutrally, possibly fronting. In this case, it was a noun phrase that got fronted, but we can front different constituents. Another example of a noun phrase being fronted would be if I took the sentence, she read that novel by Hemingway. And I want to know, is that novel by Hemingway a constituent? Well, notice I can also say, that novel by Hemingway she read. It's not an ordinary sentence out of the blue with that order, because we do this in order typically to provide contrast. So that would be a more natural sentence in a context in which you're contrasting with something else. But in such an environment, it's a perfectly good sentence. So that tells us that novel by Hemingway, in the sentence, she read that novel by Hemingway, is indeed a constituent. Notice if we tried instead, what about that novel? So if that was a constituent in the sentence, we should be able to say, that novel she read by Hemingway. But that doesn't seem good. That's ungrammatical. So in that sentence, the sequence of words, that novel, doesn't form a constituent, or it appears not to form a constituent because we can't front it. So that's some evidence, at least, that it's not a constituent. So we've got the larger one that we can move, but that sequence there doesn't allow us to move it to the front of the sentence. In all of these cases, what we've been fronting has been a noun phrase, but we can also front prepositional phrases, for example. So we could have the sentence, my sister was reading in the garden, and we could front the prepositional phrase in the garden. So we get, in the garden, my sister was reading. So that again is evidence that in the garden is a prepositional phrase. And I said before that some prepositional phrases, we don't have words that we can substitute for them. So for example, if I said, I bought a cake for my uncle, I've claimed as a prepositional phrase, but I can't replace it with then because it's not a temporal prepositional phrase. I can't replace it with there because it's not locative. So what evidence do I have that it's a constituent at all? Well, now if we look at this displacement in the sentence, I bought a cake for my uncle, I could say, well, I was buying various presents for the different members of my family. For my uncle, I bought a cake. So there we can see that we can front the sequence for my uncle as a unit, which suggests that then that in the sentence, I bought a cake for my uncle, that sequence of the preposition plus the noun phrase is indeed a constituent. We've seen that you can front NPs and PPs. You can front other categories as well. It's not that easy to find a context in which it's natural to front an adjective phrase, but it's not impossible. So if you take the sentence, it is extremely expensive, we can front that in the right kind of context. So we could say, for example, extremely expensive it is, but it's pretty good value. So that's a fairly natural sentence, and it indicates that extremely expensive is in fact a constituent in the sentence, it is extremely expensive. It's also possible to front verb phrases, but there one of the limitations is that for some reason in English we can only front non-finite verb phrases. Examples of that are things like she said that she would leave home and leave home she will. So we can say she will leave home and we can front leave home and get leave home she will. Or he thought that she had left and indeed left she had. So it's possible to front a verb phrase as long as the part that you're fronting is non-finite. So that process of topicalization or fronting is fairly general in English, and because what you're moving always has to be constituent, it can be used as a test for constituency. So far we've looked at replacement and displacement as tests for constituency. And in English there's actually also a test that combines both, where you do both replacement and displacement. And that is the process of asking WH questions. So the way we ask WH or content questions in English is we essentially replace the constituent that we want to ask about with a pro form, in this case a WH pro form. So that's like replacing a noun phrase with a pronoun. Now we're replacing it with a WH version of a pronoun. So we do that. So for example, a pro form that works for some noun phrases if they're animate is who. So just as you'd say, I saw the woman, and we can replace the woman with her, I saw her, we've got I saw who, except the other thing that we do in English, as well as using the WH form, we displace it. So questions in English involve using such a WH form and then displacing it to the beginning of the sentence. So questions involve both of those things. And that is another test for constituency. So for example, if you take the sentence, John ate a sandwich of wholemeal bread, we can replace it, we can say John ate it. We can displace it, we can say a sandwich of wholemeal bread, John ate, even though he wasn't very hungry. So those two independent tests we've already seen suggest it's a constituent. We can also question it. So you can question that just with what. So you could say, what did John eat? And the answer would be, he ate a sandwich of wholemeal bread, or just the fragment answer, which consists of only the constituent, a sandwich of wholemeal bread. So in that case, we're using questioning, again as a test for constituency, in this case of a noun phrase. We can also question other types of constituents. For adjective phrases, we could say, for example, if we take the sentence, so Miriam is incredibly tall, a possible question would be, what is Miriam? Where we've replaced the whole phrase incredibly tall with what, and again moved it to the beginning of the sentence. So the answer to what is Miriam could be Miriam's incredibly tall, or just incredibly tall. In practice, or in the general speech of most speakers of English, actually, when we want to ask about people's properties or the properties of entities, we don't usually use just what on its own. We tend to ask, what is something like? We use this more periphrastic question for reasons that I don't understand. So there isn't such a simple relation between the declarative and the interrogative, between the statement and the question, as there is in the case of noun phrases. We saw that PPs that have to do with time, temporal PPs, and PPs that have to do with location, locative PPs, can be replaced by single words. So for the locative cases, we've got there and here, and for the temporal case, we've got then. In questions as well, we have corresponding words. So for the temporal case, we've got when, corresponding to then, and for the locative case, we've got where, clearly related to there and here. So in just the same way, if you want to know whether a sequence of words is a prepositional phrase, we can try doing this kind of replacement plus displacement in the case of questions. For example, if you said, if you had the sentence, she went to the city in that year, and you want to know whether in that year is a prepositional phrase, one way is just doing the substitution, so she went to that city then. The corresponding test for the questions would be to replace it with a question word and, of course, fronted. And you'd get the question, when did she go to that city? And the answer would be, she went to that city in that year, or she went, or just the fragment answer, in that year. So that's evidence that in that year is a prepositional phrase, that it can be replaced by the question word when, which also moves. So also for PPs, we can use evidence from questions that a certain sequence is a PP. If it is a locative, when we can use where. So for example, that would be an example like, she went to the city I had heard about, and we want to know, is the city I had heard about a phrase? Is it a constituent? Well, you can say, where did she go? She went to the city I had heard about. So that's evidence that indeed it is. So for locative PPs and temporal PPs, we have these single words that can replace them in questions, just as we do in declaratives. For verb phrases, we saw that we can replace verb phrases and we can use as a test, but we don't replace them with a single word, unlike the other cases. Instead, we have the sequence do so. In a similar way, in questions, you also can't question a verb phrase with a single word. Instead, you end up questioning with what and do. So again, two words. So if you have a sentence like, Beatrice will read 1,000 novels, and you want to know whether read 1,000 novels is a verb phrase, well, the corresponding question would be, you try to replace that with what and do, and you'd ask the question, what will Beatrice do? With the answer, Beatrice will read 1,000 novels, or just read 1,000 novels. So there again, that's evidence that that sequence is in fact a verb phrase, that it can be replaced with do and what.